Chapter 3 The Princess of Mendelora. Now the greatest of all the Cherith was named Vale, a creature of great light, of power and cunning. He was given the great northern realms as his own protectorate to safeguard the people, to do battle with their enemies and to counsel them. But he grew impatient and haughty, and wondered why he ought to stoop down to earth to serve a people so far beneath him. The longer I talked to the frizzy-haired woman at the table, the more I thought I wanted to do what she had in mind. I knew I'd have to get my father's permission to do it, but I already had a feeling he'd say yes. What was there for him to dislike? I'd be making my own money, getting work experience, and it wouldn't detract from my schoolwork at all. Dad's biggest stipulation for any activity like this was that it couldn't impact school, and Stephanie's proposal passed that test with flying colors. I spent the next 30 minutes discussing the job with Stephanie, and we only stopped when another student came by and required her attention. Stephanie handed me a packet of materials to fill out for later and sent me on my way. By the time I met Daniil in the cafeteria for lunch, my head was fairly spinning with plans for the money I'd be making with this job. I'm a spender. I like to use my money rather than let it sit around doing nothing at home or in the bank. What good is having money if you don't use it? Daniil slid into the chair next to mine and prayed grace over her sandwich, then eyed me as she began to munch. "So?" she teased. "What are you going to be when you grow up?" I grinned and held out a flyer. "An in-home care attendant," I said, trying to make it sound as important as I could. It must have had some effect because Daniil's eyes widened in surprise. "Wow, what's that? I didn't know you had already decided." "I haven't, silly. I just may have found the job that I need to pay my way through art school, to start my real career." "Ah." Daniil chewed some more. "Dad calls that a stepping stone or something." I laughed. "That's why you should have been at this career day thing. You're the entrepreneur." Daniil smiled between bites, playing with her hair with her free hand. She did that when she was self-conscious, twisting her blonde hair around her fingers. "Yeah, okay. But you need all that even more than I do. You're older. You're closer to being an adult." "Thanks for reminding me," I said with a grimace. "Hey, do you want your cookie?" "Duh, yes. Don't get between a woman and her chocolate." She grinned at me. "Because you're not eating at all." Without responding, I dug into my lunchbox and found what Dad had packed for me. A pimento cheese and ham sandwich, a bag of potato chips, and 2 of the homemade chocolate chip cookies that the twins and Dad had whipped up last night. As I pulled my sandwich out of its bag, I silently thanked my father for being an understanding man. He can't stand pimento cheese. He doesn't even like the smell of it, but he still makes my sandwich with it. "It smells like vomit to me," he told me once, and I couldn't really disagree. He also said that mixing smoked deli ham with pimento cheese was sacrilege, but I just laughed. Daniil elbowed me. "Mr. Charm just showed up again." My first bite of sandwich stuck in my craw as I saw Sean enter the cafeteria. I shrank into my chair. "I'm not here," I hissed, trying to eat with my face down. "For a brand new in-home care person, you sure are shy," my sister remarked, then mercifully went quiet on the subject as several of her friends arrived at the table and plopped down trays of food around us. They were mostly Daniil's classmates, but I didn't mind them all being younger. Daniil had a talent for picking nice friends. Plus, I didn't care about looking cool by sitting exclusively with my class. It made things easier all around. I've always had a harder time making friends than she has. The rest of the day passed slowly. I couldn't concentrate on school anymore. Mr. Samuel's class on Normandy might have been interesting, but I wouldn't have known. I doodled my way through his class, starting with a brief sketch of the back of Sean Ellis's head, since he sat 2 seats in front of me. I soon meandered into other pictures. Somehow, when I'm letting my imagination wander into its creative space, my thoughts constantly turn to flying animals, and I sketch thumbnails of birds of prey. Today, the image of me as a griffin-like creature stuck in my head, and I tried to draw what that might look like. I had just completed the face when I realized that Mr. Samuels had asked me a question, and was standing there waiting for an answer. Blushing, I closed my folder and struggled to provide an answer until Mr. Samuels had mercy on me and moved on to someone else. By the time the last bell rang, I was chomping at the bit to get home. I paced the main hallway, waiting for my siblings to take their sweet time joining me. While I waited, Sean passed me in the hall surrounded by some boys from the football team, and I tried to act cool by giving him a nod in greeting. I don't think he even noticed me as the group of them laughed and horseplayed their way to the front door before melting into the afternoon sunlight. I sighed and looked at my shoes in embarrassment until I heard the twins chattering their way towards me. They were arguing about something, as usual, and as they approached, I looked up and caught Juliana's eye. She raced to me with her brother on her tail and earnestly grabbed my arm. Germaine, Joey says that the Earth goes around the sun, but I've looked at the sun, and it goes around the Earth. Can you tell him he's stupid and to stop bothering me about it? I forgot my embarrassment in an instant and tried to stifle my laughter behind my hand. After I'd recovered, I put on my most serious face and frowned at Juliana. Did you say you looked at the sun? Yeah, Juliana responded, a little confused. You looked right at it? Didn't that hurt? It's pretty bright. Well, Juliana conceded, I didn't look right at it. Kind of to the side of it. Ha ha, Joey cut in, grabbing my other arm. If she didn't look right at it, then how does she know? He grew very solemn and stared me in the eye. Tell her she's wrong, Jeremy. Tell her I'm right and she's wrong. I flicked him playfully on the ear. First of all, it's not Jeremy. You should talk. You're the one with the dirty hands. If anyone is Jeremy, it's you. I pried his hand off my arm and crouched down to fix the collar of his shirt, which had folded over into a bunch. Second of all, it depends partly on your point of view. Joey squinted at me. Huh? I rolled my eyes. Your point of view. Who is standing where? If you were on the sun and you were looking at the Earth, it would look like the Earth went around the sun. But if you stand on the Earth, it looks like the sun goes around the Earth. See what I mean? A giant grin grew across Juliana's mouth, and she shook my arm as she jumped up and down. Hee, so we're both right then, right? I stood up and assumed my responsible older sister attitude, the attitude that I know annoys the twins to no end. No, the Earth goes around the sun, I said with finality, and immediately regretted it. Joey danced a little Rumpelstiltskin jig around Juliana and gloated while I sighed and mentally begged the others to hurry up. Russell and Daniil joined us in another minute, and we all made our way outside, where Dad sat in the car in the loop with the other parents. We clambered in, Joey and Juliana still going at it, and Daniil gently trying to break them up, with Russell providing running commentary. Dad looked at me in amused bewilderment as I climbed into the passenger seat. What's all this, G? He asked in his mild-mannered voice. Oh, nothing, I replied. Just an argument about the sun, and the Earth, and different points of view. Dad chuckled. No, I meant that. He pointed to the packet of materials in my hand, marked with the In-Home Services logo. I flushed hard and bit my lip. I was pretty sure Dad would say yes to me working for Miss Morrow, but for some reason my stomach still balled up. It's from Career Day. Oh, Dad said, interested. He pulled out of the school parking lot and into traffic. Anything interesting? Did you talk to Miss Gutierrez? I blushed again, this time with embarrassment. I did talk to her. She tried her best to find me something. Dad frowned. Tried? Yeah. I shifted in my seat. She wants me to go into graphic design. I don't want to, though. Fair enough. Dad glanced over at me. Then what's that stuff you got there? I assume you found something that caught your eye. I could hear the encouraging tone in his voice, and it made me relax. Can I tell you about it at home? Dad nodded. Whenever you'd like, sweetheart. Dinner that night was spaghetti and meatballs, which everyone devoured with gusto. The twins had moved on to a new argument, something about vampires and whether they were capable of flying spaceships or whether they preferred airplanes instead. Joey predictably fell on the side of spaceships, while his more conservative twin insisted that vampires can't breathe in space and could only fly in the air. Russell even jumped in on Joey's side to point out that vampires were technically dead and that they didn't need to breathe at all, so being in space wouldn't be a problem for them. Danielle sat across the table from me, carefully working at her plate of pasta, and as the argument progressed, she would glance up at me and roll her eyes. I just shook my head back. Dad listened in amusement for a long time, not breaking into the discussion, but merely observing, until at length he took his fork and tapped it against his water glass for attention. Even without Mama's calming powers, the pinging sound cut through the chatter and brought it to silence. I looked to the head of the table where he sat, already knowing what was coming next. "So, what did all my children do today?" he asked, gesturing to Joey. "Joey, you go first. Tell me something good." "You go first because you're the youngest," Juliana snickered in his ear. "By 12 minutes, Joey shot back, annoyed. Danielle gave him a gentle nudge with her arm. "Come on, Joey. Dad asked you a question." "Fine," Joey replied, glaring at Juliana. Okay, well, we all wrote letters in class today to send to the troops who aren't home right now. And tomorrow we're putting together packages to send to them, too." Juliana grimaced. "That was what I was going to say, too." Dad grinned at her. "You can still say it, although I'd suggest you two don't argue quite so much. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," both twins said at once, then glanced at each other mischievously. Their eyes sparkled a bit too bright. I knew they still meant trouble. Dad's gaze lingered on the two of them warily for a few seconds, then moved on to Russell. "Anything to report?" Russell shrugged. "I didn't punch either of the twins today. Does that count?" Dad shot him a withering glance. "No, it doesn't." "Then I guess not." "We'll work on that then, okay?" He turned to Danielle. "What about you, Danny? What have you done today?" Danielle twirled spaghetti with her fork while she twirled her hair with her free hand. "Well, it might not be much, but Andrea in my class told me her mom is having trouble with keeping her house tidy after having her baby. So I offered to come over and help with the laundry and stuff." She swallowed. "If that's okay." Dad smiled. "It's more than okay. That's what I like to hear. Thank you for extending the help, Danny. I'm proud of you." My sister blushed under the compliment and mumbled something, but not before she had kicked me in the leg under the table. I looked askance at her, and she gestured to Dad with her head. "It's your turn, Maney," she murmured. "Don't you have something to tell?" "Yes," I whispered back, "but let me tell it." "I was letting you." Dad looked from one of us to the other, and his gaze finally settled on me after several whispered exchanges between me and Danielle. "Looks like one of you has something to tell." He opened his hand in my direction. "Germaine, go ahead." I was the one to blush now, and I pushed my plate away from me. I had waited until now to tell him about Stephanie Morrow and the in-home care job, thinking that this would be the best time. But suddenly I felt self-conscious about it, and wished I had asked him for permission in private. Now everyone would have to know. I bit the inside of my cheek. So be it. It's about the papers I picked up at the career day thing today." Dad leaned back in his chair. "We can talk about it now if you want to." "Miss Gutierrez tried to find me something art-related for school," I blurted out. "But instead I ended up finding something else, something completely different." Dad stared at me attentively. "Okay. So you're not doing art anymore, or just not graphic design?" "No, I still want to pursue art in some way," I continued. "But I found something at the career day fair that can get me the money to go to art school." "Go on." "There was a woman at the career day. She was at the booth labeled in-home services. What they do is they pay people, just ordinary people like me, to go into families' homes and work with disabled kids. Dad's eyebrows went up in pleased surprise. Sounds interesting. I've heard of this sort of thing. Autistic children and all that, yes? I inwardly sighed with relief. He seemed to be taking to this idea already. I warmed to my presentation and kept talking. Partly, yeah. Maybe even some with autism, which I have some experience with. The families are the ones who interview me, and then the facilitator sets up my payments and stuff. It's perfect. Dad nodded thoughtfully. Good. Very good. And that means you can adjust your schedule around school, right? Yes. I smiled at him. Plus it means that I make my own money to save up for one of those expensive art schools on the brochures. Dad chuckled. The more grass and trees, you know. I know. I sighed with relief. That had gone even more smoothly than I thought it would. I just need you to call my facilitator after I've filled out all my paperwork. You gotta sign some of the papers and talk with her about the job a bit. I triumphantly leaned back in my chair and put my hands on my full belly. She's really nice. We talked for a long time at the career day thing. My father smiled at me. I'm glad. And I'm glad you put yourself out there. I know it's not that easy for you to do. I blushed. Thanks. Although, I added with a laugh, she practically recruited me. Dad laughed back. Kinda why she was there, right? Right. Dad dabbed his mouth with his napkin. Well then, just give me her name and number and I'll call her tomorrow when I'm at work. Her number is in the paperwork, I replied, starting to get up to clear the dishes away. I'll get it for you later tonight. Her name is Stephanie Morrow. There came a crash from the far end of the table, and I realized with a start that Dad had dropped his water glass. His attention was not on the rapidly spreading pool of water, though, but instead riveted to my face. His own face had grown pale. Who? He whispered. What was her name? I recoiled a bit, stunned. I just said her name was Stephanie Morrow. Stephanie Morrow, my dad repeated, his gaze drifting away from me. His eyes darted back and forth in thought, and suddenly I felt that my victory may have just been ruined. My heart sank. I glanced over at Danielle, and the worry must have been evident in my face because she mirrored it. I looked back at Dad, afraid to break the silence that hung heavy over the table. He sat lost in thought for a full minute before answering. When he did, his voice sounded troubled. And were you the only student she spoke to? I was confused. No. I mean, yes and no. I was the first student to talk to her, and she acted like she had seen me from across the room and practically willed me to come over. We talked for like half an hour before anyone else came over. I saw now that same worried face that Dad had made at us when we had gone into school this morning. I figured I'd press my luck a bit. So, what do you think? Dad abruptly stood and smiled at me. It sounds great, Germaine. You have my blessing to do it. Just don't let it interfere with grades and such. He removed his dishes from the table and disappeared into the kitchen with them. I heard him drop them in the sink and turn the water on. I looked back over at Danielle and saw my sister shrug. She was as clueless as I was. When we had cleared away all the dinner dishes and watched a movie, Dad led us in family night prayers. He said a long prayer for our family, for Grandma and Great Aunt Annalyn, for everyone we knew who was having a baby, for us kids and our safety and health, and finally, a prayer for my mother. Dad prayed for her every night, without fail, like he knew that she'd be back. He always prayed for her safety, but tonight it was a little bit different. Tonight he mentioned a petition for her safety, but then tacked on something about having wisdom and discernment in what she was doing. Even when we'd finished and Dad was kissing us all goodnight, I didn't dare ask what he meant. After Dad bent my head down to kiss me on the hair, he gave me an apologetic smile. The twins want a story. I know that it's my night to read to them, but could you do it for me tonight? I studied his face in the half-light of the hallway, trying to read his expression. Is everything okay, Dad? I asked with concern. You seemed weirded out by my news earlier. Dad didn't answer right away. He rubbed the faint stubble on his chin, making a scratchy sound. That was always the sound of my father thinking. Scratch, scratch. He looked me in the eye and started to say something, but then thought better of it. Everything's fine, for now, he said at last. But keep your eyes open, Germaine. I frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Dad replied kindly, his voice more decisive, that you've always been a wonderful older sister to your siblings. You've always protected them and cared for them, even when Mama was around, and I'm proud of you for that. Keep being that for them. Just be extra diligent for now, okay? He touched my chin. Can you do that? I nodded, uncertainty clouding my mind. I felt a chill go down my spine. Yes, I sighed. Good. I bit my lip. Dad? Yes? Are we in some sort of danger? I didn't care if the question wasn't proper to ask. I felt like I needed to know. Dad swallowed before nodding slowly. We may be. How can I help? I pressed. A smile worked its way across my dad's mouth. Right now you can help by reading to the twins. I have some work to do. He gave me a quick hug and walked away. Mystified, I watched him descend the stairs until he was out of sight, his posture hunched like it bore a great weight. Something was going on, although I had no idea what. Standing in the hallway was not going to accomplish anything, though, so I shrugged off the feeling and went to my room. I reached up to the top of one of my bookshelves, feeling around until my fingers touched the supple leather I knew so well. I pulled the Book of Mendelora down from its perch and flicked a surprised spider off the cover. The tome looked as gorgeous and mysterious as it had always looked, making me stop to touch the figures on the cover. In a rush, the images from that night long ago flitted into my head and carried me back. That stormy night was the first time I'd ever seen the book. Another chill shot up my spine as the shadow of the intruder passed before my mind's eye. Before he died, he had reached out to my mother for help. Who was that man? What sort of help did he want? Then I remembered my mother's words from that night, and my confusion deepened. She had spoken of him, but she wasn't talking about the man on the ground. I was sure of that. Then who was he? Sighing for lack of answers, I picked my way back down the dark hallway to the twins' room, where they both sat next to the flickering nightlight on the wall, pretending it was a campfire. Juliana held a plastic fishing pole from some long-lost game and had stuck a cotton ball onto the end of it. As I entered their room, she held it up with a toothy grin. Look, Germaine, we're making marshmallows! I raised an eyebrow at her. Okay. Do you want one? No, thanks. Joey held up a plastic fish he'd been tending to near their campfire. He grinned at me. Marshmallows are for camp dessert. Have some fish first. I just caught it in the river nearby. He smacked his lips and pretended to take a nibble. I laughed as I collapsed into a yellow beanbag chair in the corner. I thought you hated fish, Joey. Don't you hate fish? Joey scowled at me. This is pretend fish. I don't hate pretend fish. Like fish sticks, those are pretend fish, too. Whatever you say, I said as I tapped the beanbag chairs on both sides of me. Come on, do you want to hear a story or not? Is it from the fairy book? Juliana squealed as she pitched the fishing rod and leaped over to me. To Juliana, it would always be the fairy book, not the Book of Mendelora. Funny enough, there's only one story of a fairy in the entire book so far, and it's a pretty thick book. I like the battle story from last week, Joey insisted, scampering over to my other side and burrowing into his beanbag chair. Can we read that one again? No, I replied, leaning back against the wall. That one was kinda gruesome. We're going to read the next chapter. I pulled the pages open to my bookmark and realized that we were close to the end of the whole book. It was a long volume, but we'd chipped away at it for years and years, and now found ourselves approaching the finish line. It was weird. I didn't remember the book being this big when I was a little girl. "What's this one called?" Juliana asked, her eyes shining with anticipation. I cleared my throat. "This chapter is called The Princess of Mendelora. Here we go." "Blah!" Joey cried, making a face. "I want to hear about the battles, not a stupid princess." I gave him my evilest evil eye and poked his leg. "Can you just be quiet long enough to hear it? You might like it. You liked the other princess story in here." Joey scowled, but still snuggled up under my arm. "Fine." "Good." I turned back to the book, where a beautiful inked illustration of a woman in a flowing gown graced the top of the page. Crimson ink underneath it spelled out the chapter name. I began to read, and all three of us succumbed to the story's spell. On a fine day in mid-spring, when the flowers in the gardens of Carteras had bloomed into pink and purple and white blossoms, all the city buzzed with anticipation for the springtime celebration. Even Princess Morin roamed the streets of Carteras, running gaily from one shop to the next, inspecting the food for the communal feast and ensuring that all would be right for the festivities. The people of Carteras, as well as all of Mendelora, loved the red-haired Princess Morin for her charm and kindness and wonderful beauty. Just like her mother, they all said, a true branch from the same trunk. I stopped and swallowed my emotion back. The twins both looked eagerly to me for more, though, so I had to continue. Walking at the princess's side was another tall and graceful woman, the daughter of one of the king's counselors. Her name was Sarah Gray, already a famed wise woman and shape-changer, even at the tender age of 19 summers. She and the princess formed an inseparable pair. Juliana laid her head on my knee, looking at the book sideways as she cuddled her stuffed rabbit. "Is that a picture of Princess Morin?" she asked, pointing to the top of the page. I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe it's Sarah Gray." The stories of the royal family were okay, but the counselors to the king had all the most interesting stories. I liked them the best. I kept reading. That day, when the sun had climbed to the top of the sky, the preparations were at their greatest pitch when a shadow fell across the city. A great cloud billowed up from the horizon and covered the entire place, and the wind blew cold. A great fear fell upon all the people. They looked up to see a fiery creature break free from the middle of the cloud and wheel into the sky. It passed over the city so low that Sarah could see the black pupils of the creature's eyes. She and Princess Morin knew right away what it was, and their hearts felt cold with fear. Vale had broken free of his prison in the deep mountain fortress and was making good his escape. Joey held onto my leg so hard that I felt my circulation slowing down. "He escaped?" he exclaimed. "How did he escape? I thought they locked him up for 100 years after the big battle." He bit his fingernails as he stared into my face with worried eyes. I chuckled at him. "I thought this was a girly chapter and you weren't interested." Joey poked me. "Just keep reading, please." I did so. As Princess Morin and Sarah Gray ran about getting people to shelter from the creature above, Vale swooped down so low that the entire street corner filled with his shadowy form. With a shriek, he hurled himself at the princess, attacking her with such force that she had no chance to defend herself. The people screamed and ran, but Sarah ran towards the foul creature, desperate to save her friend. The ground roiled with shadow and fire, but before Sarah had even gotten close to Vale, he soared back into the sky. The storm clouds gathered up around him and disappeared, leaving Carteras once again in the blinding sunlight. But the princess was nowhere to be seen. I went to turn the page, my heart pounding from the story, but the page wouldn't turn over. I frowned and pulled at it, but it stayed stuck to the next page. In a minor panic, I pulled the next page after that, and found that it was stuck too. So was the next. The twins eyed me warily as I tried to free the stuck pages, and finally Joey spoke up. What happens next, Germaine? I growled in disgust and flipped all the way to the end, only to discover that all the pages from that point onward were stuck together. I turned to Joey. Did you get a hold of this book and get jelly on it or something? I demanded. Joey shook his head, his eyes wide. You told me not to touch the book, and I didn't. I promise. I turned to Juliana. You? Or Russell? Did anyone spill something on the book? I can't get the pages unstuck. Aww, Joey moaned. Does that mean we don't know what happens next? I looked grimly down at the book and nodded. Yeah, that's what it means. I can't get them apart without ripping them. I stood up and closed the book despite the twins' protests and ushered them to their beds. I'll get Dad to look at it, I said, trying to console them. We'll try it again later. Once the twins were tucked in, I left their room and went back to my own. I switched on the desk lamp and brought the book under the light, thinking that maybe I could try to free the pages myself. Opening the book back up to the stuck spot, I examined the page edges closely. They looked like they had been glued shut into one solid mass, but without the hardness of dried glue. I toyed with it in frustration for another 2 minutes, trying to bend them apart. No luck. Then something caught my eye, all the way over on the left edge of the last free page. It was an illustration that I hadn't noticed before, of the creature Vale emerging from the fortress where he'd been imprisoned for 100 years. My eyes widened as I studied the illustration, but it was not Vale's twisting figure that seized my attention, but the somber lines of the fortress behind him. I reached under my desk for my art portfolio and pulled out a large piece of folded paper. I unfolded it across the desk to reveal the 4-foot square mural I had drawn of a dark fortress, its grand and somber mass towering above a forbidding moat. I looked at my drawing, then at the illustration in the book. Line for line, the two matched perfectly.